He doesn't pound the table or fling open palace windows to make a speech. He lowers his voice and lets the sentence do the heavy lifting. Change is on my agenda. Not a tantrum against tradition, not a bonfire of the vanities, an engineer's promise to adjust the machine so it hums instead of rattles. That's how the Prince of Wales frames it to Eugene Levi with Windsor at his back. Change for good, change he enjoys, change he doesn't fear. And immediately the question that has stalked his adulthood steps out of the shadow and asks for a straight answer. How radical is he willing to be when the crown is finally his to steer? If you came looking for a manifesto, you won't get one. William doesn't deal in thunderclaps, he deals in tolerances and talk. He keeps the capital R on ice and writes with the smaller r he mentioned last autumn, a working alphabet for a monarchy that wants to be less cathedral, more workshop. He is not auditioning for a republic's applause. He is reminding the kingdom that continuity can be modernized without being mutilated, that pomp is not policy, and that policy, if you do it right, becomes habit, and habit becomes culture before anyone has time to panic about the end of everything. Watch the way he positions tradition, not as a relic under glass but as a tool you test. Is it still fit for purpose? Is not a rebellious question, it is an adult one. Some rituals pass that test and keep their shine. Others fail it and need to be filed down or folded into something less performative and more useful. That is not heresy, that is maintenance. And maintenance, in this family, is the most radical thing you can quietly excel at. The comparisons are inevitable and instructive. Charles as Prince rewired public debate by talking architecture, organics, the environment, then damped the volume as king and became cautious where his mother had been glacial. William's trajectory may invert the arc, cautious heir, surgical monarch. He has watched leaking briefings rot trust from the inside. He has watched balcony photo ops by 36 hours of goodwill while a single misstep burned through 36 months. He sounds like a man who has learned the price list by heart and intends to stop overpaying for optics. Not overly radical is the phrase the cautious will cling to and miss the point. In bureaucracies, the difference between cosmetic and consequential is always in the calendar. Close a door once and it's a gesture, close it every week for a year and you've created a corridor. William's change program looks like corridors, fewer working royals with ambiguous remits, more impact per appearance, patronages that pass a usefulness audit, events that come with deliverables, not just dress codes. If a tradition can't articulate its public value in a paragraph, he will ask the impolite but necessary follow-up, then why are we doing this? He is not coy about the family piece either. History, he says, doesn't overwhelm him, family can. That sentence reads like a design spec for the next reign. The institution can absorb reform, the nursery can't absorb chaos. So you separate them with intent. You pull the rope bridge taut between public service and private peace and you stop letting the storm on one side knock the other into the river. That is why his smaller R matters, it's a pressure valve. Lower the temperature of spectacle and you give your children a shot at ordinary rhythms, school runs that aren't stakeouts, holidays that aren't hunts, a kitchen table that stays a kitchen table and doesn't become a briefing room with cereal bowls. He isn't pretending the last year didn't hurt. He admits the family's health crises took him to not great places, and he says it without martyrdom or melodrama. That candor is itself a break from the old code. The stiff upper lip turned out to be a backlog, and backlogs become books. William's version of strength is to say the quiet thing once, correctly, and then build systems that mean he doesn't have to say it again, guardrails around the children, humane schedules for the household, a communications culture that privileges silence over snackable snark. The constitutional scholars hear all this and translate it into governance. A slimmer front line. Fewer councillors of state in the grey zone between technically qualified and publicly acceptable. Honours that track service in years, not in headlines per quarter. Less balcony choreography, more boring excellence. The point isn't to starve the country of pageantry, the point is to make pageantry feel earned, rare, resonant, a punctuation mark rather than a constant drumbeat that drowns out the substance it's meant to underscore. And then there is the thing he doesn't have to say because everyone can see him doing it, environmental seriousness as operating principle, not personality quirk. That means royal households that measure their footprints without fanfare, estates that plant for the century, not the season, motorcades that whisper, roofs that drink sunlight. Charles wrote that script. William is turning it into standard operating procedure. Change for good here is literal lower emissions, lower bills, higher credibility with a generation that can smell greenwash through a screen. Will he swing the axe where the country craves blood? The answer will arrive disguised as housekeeping. The Sandringham walk without the Yorks, the balcony without the ambiguities, the investiture lists without the names that make phones buzz, the graceful retirement of honors that no longer survive daylight. Gesture will read as justice, but the principle behind it is colder, risk management. You don't pour clean water through a dirty pipe and then write essays about why the glass looks cloudy. You change the pipe. His relationship with the king, close, functional, occasionally rumored to creak, isn't a soap opera, it's a handover plan. Charles made him Prince of Wales quickly because both men understand that clarity calms markets, and the monarchy lives and dies by a market of belief. They do not need to agree on every sentence. They need to agree on the spine of the book, smaller, steadier, saner. The occasional anonymous gripe about workload or style is noise from rooms that don't sign the checks. The signal is the work they do side by side when the state visits arrive and the diary turns into choreography. When you see father and son hitting their marks with an almost military neatness, you are watching succession handled like a craft, not a cliff. And yet, this is a monarchy, not a management seminar. Myth still matters. William understands that, and he is trying to write a new one, a family that doesn't feed on itself for ratings, an institution that resists the algorithm's addiction to outrage, a crown that shows its face less often and means it more when it does. For a public weary of palace psychodrama, that myth is not boring, it is medicinal. The open question is scale. Will not overly radical end up remapping everything that counts by 1,000 tiny cuts you barely notice until the picture looks different? That is how systems really change. You stop doing 5 things that never made sense, you shrink 3 things that got bloated, you rescue 2 things that matter and fund them properly, you put adults in rooms that used to be green rooms, you make sure cameras arrive last, not first. 12 months later, the approval curve stabilizes among the under 35s not because you begged them to care, but because you stopped insulting their attention span with fluff. That brings us to the quietest, hardest frontier, money. Value for money is not a phrase previous reigns loved to hear in the same sentence as monarchy, but it's the only sentence that will matter in a decade. William's instincts point toward transparency without masochism. Publish what the public pays, show the return in outcomes, trim the fat without starving the muscle. You don't win Republicans with spreadsheets, you do keep the movable middle. That middle, not the diehards at either end, decides whether the next generation sees a crown or just a logo. He will be accused of timidity by those who mistake decibels for courage. He will be accused of vandalism by those who prefer their history embalmed. He will ignore both, which is itself a tactic. The rage machine wants a brawl, he wants throughput. The only scoreboard he will look at is whether the work lands where it's supposed to. Early years programs that actually alter life chances, mental health efforts with measurable wait time reductions, homelessness pilots that survive election cycles, conservation projects that add biodiversity you can count, not hashtags you can't. And somewhere under all the strategy is a kitchen scene he keeps writing around, a boy who will be king, asked to grow up in a house that functions, not performs. George won't grow up the same, he said recently, and that is the most radical sentence in the whole dossier. It means the next sovereign will not have to unlearn as much as his father did. It means the institution will absorb the cost of maturity so a child doesn't have to. It means that when the future finally turns up with its usual impolite bang, the family at the center of the blast has the habits of resilience baked in. So how radical will he be? Radical enough to make quiet look like strength again. Radical enough to say no on the days when yes would be easier. Radical enough to run a crown like a craft for people who no longer believe in magic tricks. Change for good is not a slogan to him, it's a maintenance schedule. Oil the parts that squeak. Replace the parts that fail. Retire the parts that never did anything but glitter. Keep the lights on. Keep the roof tight. Keep faith with a country that doesn't ask for miracles, only for competence with a little ceremony on the side. If he delivers that, he won't have reinvented the monarchy. He will have done something rarer, made it make sense.